Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Sociology, Design and Disaster panel as part of the Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action Conference. Before we begin, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are all joining us today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I would also like to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am your host for today's panel. My name is Jaspreet Kaur and I'm a research assistant and training coordinator at the Gender and Disaster Pod. And I'm really excited to be bringing this panel to all of you and really excited to introduce them to you. And they'll offer a wealth of insight across the sociology, design and disaster context. So due to time, I'll just give a brief overview of who's on the panel. But if you'd like more information about who our panelists are, you can visit our website for their speaker profiles. So today on our panel, we have Nikhila Madabhushi, who is an architect and is leading a recovery project in Gippsland after the Black Summer bushfires. We have Daniel Miller, the General Manager on Country at Gunaikurnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation. Christy Bryar, who is also an architect and a Black Summer survivor, and Jefa Greenaway, who was our keynote speaker earlier, and the co-founder of Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria. I'd also like to encourage anyone and everyone to ask questions in this session. We'd like to make this session as interactive as possible, so please use the Q&A panel that's at the bottom of your screens to ask any questions. And if you have any thoughts or comments or reflections during any of the presentations or discussions, we'd like you to please put them into the chat so that we can continue having these discussions on the side. And Vanessa will put all of this information into the chat as well if you'd like to refer back to it. So without wasting any more time, I'd like to invite Nikhila to start off this session. So Nikhila, who is an architect, is working in Gippsland as doing a recovery project. And that's what she's going to talk about with us today. So Nikhila, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Jaspreet, and hi to everyone on the panel and everyone who's listening in. It's nice to be able to share a little bit of our collaboration today. And so, yeah, so as you were saying, Jaspreet, my work at the moment is divided across architectural practice, but also research and education as well. And that occurs through an innovation fellowship I'm doing at Monash at the moment. And really, in short, it's geared at and it's really coming off the back of what sort of Jefa concluded his presentation with, about acknowledging that architecture and the way we're raised in architecture, it's a patriarchal kind of traditional conventional process. And so given sensitive dilemmas like the bushfires, which often have a lot of hidden narratives within sort of the bigger media story of the bushfire and the phenomenon of bushfires, is like, how do we as architects engage with that, And so it's really, I guess, the project that I'm working on at the moment is like, how do we rethink design and reconstruction and find new mechanisms for our processes that really can leverage local cultural knowledge, find legitimate ways of working into disciplines. So how do we actually do that? Short of obviously engaging an engineer and building surveyors and the people that we have to employ to get buildings done, what about everyone else? What about local knowledge? And then lastly, looking at participation. So it's one thing to invite people to the table and sort of come up with community engagement strategies, but then what do we do with that information, especially as architects, when we've got sort of these very preordained processes that haven't really been rethought in a very long time? How do we actually develop new mechanisms to have broader conversations and have, I guess we've started calling them more knowledgeable others at the table in order to have better outcomes, given the very permanence of what we do with space and the built. So, yeah.
Thanks, Nikhila. So what exactly is your project on in Gippsland? What are you working on?
Yeah, so that's a broad summary of the themes, but essentially we're working across, and when I say we, It's a research-led project that I'm doing with 20 master's students, which sort of commenced the middle of last year into this year. And so there's 3 recovery projects that we're looking at in particular, and 2 of them are in Mallacoota and Genoa, which is Far East Gippsland. And we're sort of looking at broad sort of townscape reimaginations through co-creation. And then the other project takes us a little bit further west, but still within East Gippsland or Gunaikurnai country, where we're actually working on the Wangan Amphitheatre, which is a new cultural performance space for GLaWAC. And so that's kind of how I've intersected with Christy and Daniel more specifically. So Christy as a Mallacoota local, but also an architect, and Daniel in terms of him being the general manager on country at GLaWAC. So, yeah. And I guess, I mean, just to add something else about that, I guess the 3 projects, you know, they are not recovery in the sense that they are buildings or spaces or community assets that were destroyed as a result of the fires necessarily, but they are positioned in a sense that they are happening in a context of recovery, long-term recovery, and acknowledge that there are pre-existing conditions and issues and dilemmas that these certain communities were actually enduring leading up to and after the fires as well. So in the case of GLaWAC, it's actually more about the broader aspect of Gunaikurnai identity, and then more specifically their work in caring for country. But in the case of Mallacoota and Genoa, they are regional towns that have benefited from tourism, but apart from that, actually are quite under-resourced as a result of being quite remote. And so there's these existing conditions that we have to factor in before we actually even think about the fires, if that makes sense. So I hope that gives you a backdrop.
Yeah, that's great, Nikki. I'll pass on to Daniel. Daniel, did you want to tell us a bit more about the collaboration between GLaWAC and the project that Nikki was mentioning?
Yep. Yeah, no, thank you both, and it's a good introduction to what's happened. So, yeah, Daniel Millam, General Manager on Country with the Gunaikurnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation. So we're a traditional owner corporation that represents the Gunaikurnai people and which covers most of Gippsland, and a significant part of our settlement area was impacted by the fires, and some really heavily impacted. The project that Nikki's talking about is an important one for GLaWAC from a couple of different perspectives. So it's not just about the structure, and I was listening to speakers before. I think I'm probably at risk of just saying a lot of things which you as a group of architects already kind of know, and that, so I guess just bear with me, but hopefully there's something of interest that I say. But the in the work that Nikki's doing with us, it's very much around the journey is just as important as the finished product, and for Aboriginal people, having a connection to whatever the project is, it's that's what's important, and because otherwise there'll be no commitment to it, no utilization of it, and all that kind of stuff. In sort of reflecting on what this today's about, I guess my view and what I think is important is ensuring that connection. And so I'm clearly speaking from a traditional owner perspective, but I think it's probably from any perspective, making sure that connection is there. And in looking, I've been a part of quite a number of these sorts of scale bushfires, and there, whilst the impact might be different, in a conventional sense, it still has huge impacts on country. So we've had these sort of scale fires in 2003, and then 2006 and 2007, and then Black Saturday, and then now this last one. And I think so when you're approaching this activities after these kind of events, there really can be no assumptions made, and if we're talking about traditional owners, there absolutely can be no assumptions made. We have to make that the journey to discovering what it is you want to do. It needs to have the weight and the energy and the attention that it deserves. And in witnessing the I think this event more than others has sort of shown to me the different way that community members will react to a large-scale event, and I sort of see it in generational Gippslanders but as a which is different to newer Gippslanders who perhaps haven't had the experience and exposure to fires, and there's always going to be people at the real pointy end of the stick who've lost houses and other assets, and that'll be that's different again. But so not assuming that that people are going to react in a certain way, not assuming that and what's really relevant today is not assuming that you can just ask one component of a group. And for us, for Nikki and all her fantastic students that are working with us, who I hope are getting some value out of it, making sure that they talk to enough men and women and performers and non-performers, what I mean by that is people who use the space. So trying to cover everything it's really hard, and it's quite a challenge, but it's an important one, and that's what's going to make sure that a project is successful. And I probably should leave it there, and happy to take questions later. Thanks, Jaspreet.
Thanks, Daniel. I'd like to now welcome Christy. Christy, did you want to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone for coming and joining us today. I guess sort of picking up on a bit of a theme here, following on from Jefa's presentation and then Nikki and Daniel's thoughts. I come from a slightly different perspective in that I'm an architect who's living and working in Gypsy Point near Mallacoota, and was present during the bushfires, the Black Summer bushfires. And after a disaster, a lot of agencies and organisations are present very quickly and offering help, with all sorts of things, food and clothing and shelter and all of those immediate things. And interestingly, one of those organisations, which is supported by the Institute of Architects, is Architects Assist, which was initiated on the 4th of January 2020, which was the same day I found out that I lost my house in the bushfires on New Year's Eve. So yeah, while the offer of pro bono architectural services is commendable and welcomed, it's and surely called on at some point when people are ready. I've sort of been left wondering, is there something more architects can do that's perhaps more pressing and more valuable in those early stages of recovery? Very few people are in a place even a year and a half down the track to even think about rebuilding. That's still quite a far away thing. And certainly in those early stages, it's hard to even think about a future at all. It's very minute to minute, and that slowly stretches out. And I think, I don't know, personally, it's about day to day at the moment. So really, for me, I think more importantly, social and psychological recovery needs to happen first. And I think this is somewhere, a space that architects are really well placed to operate in similar to some comments that Jefa made in his presentation, and both Daniel and Nikki made, is this idea of perhaps leaving the ego out and the notion of maybe that there is an outcome at the end, and really engaging in the process, really deeply listening to community, and really to help community and individuals understand what is valuable to them about the place that they live and how they operate in it, and to understand what is lost, but also to understand what isn't lost, and to find those threads of what's not lost, to try to build on those. They're kind of a seed to ground the community and to create some stability in a traumatised community. A little example of that for everyone was in Mallacoota, literally hours after the front had passed and we knew we were safe. A little coffee shop, Origami, was open, and for those first few weeks, that was, you know, this recovery hub almost, where everyone could go. You would see people that you know in a sea of people that you don't. You know, there's a lot of relief agencies and military and government officials there. There was very few people that you know, but you knew you could find them there. You could hug, you could cry, you know, you could find out information, you could charge your mobile phone, you could borrow a book, all these things, and all over something really, really normal, like having a cup of coffee. And it's those little pieces of normality when your whole world has been tipped upside down that are really valuable. And so I guess that's what I've been thinking about, is how do we find those little pieces of normality and build on those for a community to build some strength first, and build some social and psychological, you know, to anchor yourself before you even start thinking about building buildings, or, you know, I hear the term building back better a lot of the time, but I don't know how you can even think about that in those early stages. And so, yeah, I think architects are really well placed. You know, they're good thinkers about placemaking and well-being. And I think they could collaborate with perhaps psychologists and relief agencies to assist people on sort of formulating those ideas about what's valuable. And the other thing that happens post disaster and in a trauma state is there are multiple traumas apart from the event itself, which is really interesting. That you know, the event itself changes your world very immediately and very destructively, and it's devastating. And then a short while after, you settle with that, and even though it's very distressing to see people's houses burnt on the ground, that suddenly they become the anchors in the community, because they're still recognisable. Even though they're a burnt out pile of rubble, it's our burnt out pile of rubble. You know, it's still, you feel like you still have something. And this is again, this idea of threads of what still exists and what's meaningful. And so like those bits of recognising things, even though they're destroyed, that's about recognising the character of what was there, the character of the town. And so now we have another wave of change coming, which is new buildings coming in. There's a whole raft of houses mostly coming off the back of a truck at the moment. And people have got a new anxiety of change happening to the town. What is it going to look like? Is it just going to be kind of, you know, cookie cutter modular houses lining what was once a really interesting streetscape to the beach, for example? And so it's this sort of instability and constant change that creates anxiety. And I think, you know, where architects can play a role is to help people understand that better, so that the decisions that we make as individuals and a community are going to be strength-based and facilitating recovery and healing. And so, you know, for my mind, the skill of the architect is not necessarily designing these buildings, but actually the process getting to there, you know, enabling people to express what it is that you know, their place in the world and how they want to live. And we do that all the time in sort of conventional commissions, but, you know, like, can we also do this without a built outcome? And I think we can. I think we definitely can. And I think it's a really valuable step in helping community take their own recovery into their own, you know, agency, and to build from a position of strength rather than the vulnerable space of trauma. Yeah.
Thanks, Christy. That's been really insightful. and particularly interesting in terms of the way in which you're recovering and the insights that you bring from that design perspective, but also from your experience of going through Black Summer. So thank you for that. I'd like to now invite Jefa, and Jefa, thank you for your presentation earlier. It was really, really interesting. And one of the questions I have is how can we incorporate Indigenous knowledge in the disaster preparedness, recovery, response stages, and what does that look like from your perspective?
Well, it starts with a conversation in the first instance, and understanding that there is great wisdom in 3,000 generations of knowledge. And I think it's also worth reflecting on the fact that in many regards, Indigenous people have encountered, what Glenn Albrecht, the philosopher, describes as solastalgia, which is the unease that the natural environment around you is changing for the worse. And so we've seen, for instance, that we've scarred country, we've burnt country, we've felled country, and we've polluted country. And the residual effect is that the environment is now more ripe for further disasters, as we've seen. And so certainly, I guess, building upon and learning from processes and Indigenous knowledge systems like traditional burning practices and other understandings of the ability to actually read country can actually inform and be part of the solution. And so I think it's really important to draw upon all the knowledge systems available to assist and to, I guess, build a coalition of the willing to find solutions, and that we can all be part of, part of that, and certainly ensuring that Indigenous voices are included, and carving out the requisite time and space to have the meaningful conversations as well, because often we tend to focus on the reasons why we can't do something, rather than acknowledging that sometimes you need to slow down to speed up. And there is this sort of tendencies to say that, oh, we don't have the time or the resources to enable that level of engagement. And for me, it's important also to build upon a conversation and to be able to capture insights and translate that into meaningful design action. Requires a level of, I guess, cultural intelligence. And I think in part, what I'm saying is that there is a role and an opportunity for design practitioners to build that level of cultural awareness and cultural intelligence, knowing that in many respects, people are on a sort of a learning journey, and that it can certainly be done in partnership with the knowledge keepers. And so that's certainly some of the sort of processes that we seek to embed as part of what should really be normative design practice.
Yeah, thanks, Jefa. There was a question in the Q&A that I thought was really interesting, and we didn't get a chance to answer it, so I just want to put this to you. Aboriginal people are the first ecologists. Victor Stephenson speaks of Western science as new knowledge compared to the First Nations people's knowledge, and he notes the problem of hierarchical structures preventing progress. How have you and other Indigenous architects progressed cultural equity?
Yeah, well, it's certainly about thinking in a broader sense. So this sort of non-hierarchical, non-silo-based approach, understanding that through an Indigenous ways of knowing and being, is that everything is interconnected. So the moment you start to shift the conversation around something which is much more holistic, then you start to understand the sort of residual effect and impact of our decisions. And so what we certainly try and do in the projects that we undertake is to ensure that we develop a culturally responsive design process. And one of the devices or the methods that we employ is we benchmark our practice against the International Indigenous Design Charter. And what that enables us to do is to demonstrate, I guess, best practice in terms of acknowledging and embedding Indigenous voices in this sort of collaborative co-design process to ensure that we have the requisite cultural permissions to engage with particular opportunities, and understanding, I guess, the responsibility that comes with that we're not hoovering up Indigenous knowledge and somehow claiming it as our own, but also acknowledging that even among Indigenous design practitioners, we can only speak to our own experience in our own mob. So we actually have to go through the exact same process as non-Indigenous people to develop trust, to build respect, to have a conversation, and to provide the means and the mechanism to ensure that the many voices are part of the solution. So that would be my reflection.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. There was another question here around you mentioning the Venice Biennale, and that there's a famous Paris building that has Indigenous art on the facade. Do you think that Australian Aboriginal design in art and architecture is respected here as well as overseas?
Well, sometimes it requires attention, away from our own experience for it actually to be acknowledged or respected. But I think one of the risks that is often we're encountering, particularly in the design space, is this sense that we can somehow badge a project with an Indigenous language. And the tendency has been often this sort of the muralisation of culture, where you essentially cloak the surface of a proposition with Indigenous imagery, as opposed to actually embedding a project with Indigenous design thinking as part of the DNA of the project. And to me, that's kind of the next step in terms of, as we start to evolve our thinking to a much more sophisticated and nuanced way of designing. So as we start to move beyond the kitsch, the stereotypical, the patronising references, to something which becomes much deeper, much more meaningful, much more impactful, and something whereby the considered sort of intellectual rigour that underpins the thinking is what informs part of the solution. And as we're curating the Venice Architecture Biennale at the moment, Tristan Wong and myself, and what we've actually done as part of this proposition is to look at those intersection points, the intersection between identity, culture, country, some of the shared challenges around climate change and the impacts of colonisation, to inform design practice and to show a range of exemplar projects across the country of how architects are sort of grappling with these challenges and how we can start to create new modes of practice, which is certainly that is inclusive and acknowledges that there are shared experiences globally as well.
Great, thank you so much, Jefa. I think there's so much, we could have a lot more time just covering Indigenous perspectives and knowledge in the disaster space, but thank you for your time. I'd like to now go into the Q&A panel. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to come onto the screen, please. And then I'll ask a few of the questions that are in the Q&A panel to all of you. Great, so there's a one for all of you. The question is, can architects help communities prepare for a disaster, recovery and reconstruction? For example, before a bushfire, and what does that actually look like? What do you see the role of the architect being before a bushfire? Nikki, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. In some ways, I would hope that the work that we're doing at the moment is helping the community groups we're collaborating with to prepare before a bushfire, purely in the fact that I think the problem with the way bushfires are perceived is that they're a static event. They're not seen as this cyclical event, and they're not seen in connection to the next one or the one after that, or scale. And so fires are happening every summer to some degree, but there are critical issues with the management of the natural environment at the moment that have created what's been happening across the last decade. If we talk about 2009 to now, and the short gap between two fairly, disastrous fires. And so I think it's, to use the example, people are still recovering from the 2009 fires in a way, and that could be happening whether they were from Marysville or from Murrumbidgee Shire or the area that was destroyed, or if they've actually left that place, they're still recovering from the particular experience of that. And that could be, and like just as Jefa was sort of talking about solastalgia and that sorrow for the loss, the deterioration of the natural environment, I think a lot of what the stories that came out of 2009 was about topophilia as well. So this love of place that was then displaced as a result of the fires. And so I think where the work that we're doing right now is kind of understanding local people's topophilia, so their love of place, even though it's been through such extreme circumstances, as design professionals, as architects to be, in the case of the students as well, slowly finding pathways to understand the diversity of that topophilia and that love of place, and how we as people who are charged with assisting the design of the built environment can do that in diverse ways. So not necessarily, and it's kind of been repeated many times by everyone, not just in that way where it's a built outcome, but could it be assisting with the development of a design brief that can be taken as a document to then go and seek funding? Could it be through some workshops that facilitate conversations about space? Could it be about sort of even offering kind of what Christy was talking about before, taking a bit more of a pastoral responsibility as well? So there's the offer of pro bono services through certain networks, which is certainly commendable as well. But how are we as architects, supported to come in and just talk to people and answer some of the sort of bureaucratic questions that they've got about going through planning and building when they haven't ever had to think about it before? And so, we are trained to think across those different sort of landscapes. And we are also innately, if we came to this profession, probably care about the 3 Ps that Jefa was talking about before, which was people, purpose, and place. And so somehow, somewhere along the line, we seem to have to leave that at the door because of the way architecture is practiced. But I guess I think kind of trying to find these, mechanisms and like kind of engaging in these types of conversations to go back to the origins of what we're actually meant to be doing, I think hopefully is helping people prepare, or one way in to help prepare for fires before they occur as well. So yeah, not looking at it in a linear way, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. No, thanks, Nikki. Christy, did you want to add anything to that?
I just add that I think that where architects can assist in that area is just somehow getting a seat at the table. There's all these sort of siloed organisations. We talk about bushfires in this country all the time. It's not, and when you live in a place like where I do, you don't take that for granted. It's something that's at the forefront of your mind, and but somehow, architects and well, there's a lot of people missing at the table actually. That it's sort of, I think there just needs to be more collaboration across all the different, whether it be the agencies, government bodies, planners, urban planners, local Indigenous community, the even just various walks of life within the community, whether it be the farming community or the families, whatever it might be. And I think it's, as Nikki said, it's just getting that diversity of opinion and voices heard, to then, you know, that's going to build a resilience in the community itself. You know, I talked earlier before about social and psychological recovery. If that's strong, which thankfully it started from a strong place here in Mallacoota, then you already have the building blocks to move forward when you need to. I think that those things are more important, not to discredit other things, you know, resilience, building, and, you know, for remote places like this, self-sustaining, you know, power sources or food production or whatever it might be, those things are important too. But I really think having a strong sense of place and a strong sense of community are the critical building blocks to resilience and rebuilding.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Christy. I have another one for you here.
Mm-hmm.
It's asking, are BOL's bushfire assessment levels a good thing?
I think they help people have an understanding about the dangers of bushfire, of a big event like Black Summer or Black Saturday, for example. But they can also give people a bit of a false sense of security, potentially, to think that, you know, if you've built your house at a certain level, that then you're safe. Again, I think when you live in places, you know, when you're surrounded in an environment of bushland, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I know I'm deeply connected to where I live, and you read the landscape, you read the environment, you know what's happening. We knew, in a sense, well before a fire started in East Gippsland, that there would be a fire in East Gippsland. You know, you could see it. The land was telling you that was the case. So I think they're good as a guideline, maybe, but I personally think, you know, take it with a big grain of salt. There's a lot of things, a lot of factors that come into play that you know, that might not mean that you're safe or that your house is safe just because it's rated. You know, there was a Bell 40 house built in Mallacoota in the last 10 years that's no longer standing there. So, you know, and that apparently was simply, you know, it was over Christmas, people were away, and a bathroom window was left ajar as, you know, a completely innocuous activity that all of us probably do at time to time. And there's your weak link into a Bell 40 house. So, yeah, there's lots of factors involved.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christy. There's another a question for, I think, Jefa, for yourself. This is, in deep listening, is there a difference between what people want generally based on gender for both home and community?
I don't really feel that deep listening is a gendered quality. I think it's something that everyone can do. And I think in some respects, you know, sort of going back to this sort of bigger question of the contribution of architects in terms of sort of disaster preparedness, I think there is an acute obligation and responsibility of the industry and architects in particular to become more political, to become advocates for meaningful change, to speak up, to understand that we're often hitting up against policy and guidelines and other mechanisms which actually preclude the capacity to actually influence change. And I studied political science before I studied architecture, and the older I get, the more I realise how invariably a lot of what we do needs to become actually more political. And I think if we move beyond some of the ideologies, so we're hearing that certainly around climate change, you know, for my way of thinking, a lot of the, you know, considerations around sustainability and the like goes back to the essence of, you know, a sort of a very sort of deep philosophical position around caring for country. As Arnie Diker eloquently puts it, if you care for country, it'll in turn care for you. And so a lot of the residual effects of not doing that impacts on our capacity to ameliorate some of the challenges and the potential disasters that can befall us. And so I think certainly there's an opportunity to to really be much more assertive as an industry and as a profession to ensure that our political voice informs the necessary policy parameters to ensure that we can actually be set up and responsive to the challenges that we often confront.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jefa. I'm going to take a step back from the architectural perspective, and Daniel, put a question to you that we have in our Q&A panel, which is, what is the generational difference that you mentioned in your speech? And could you please expand on that a bit more?
I don't think that I probably don't have anything clever to say about it. I think it's really just the difference in I guess it's the dynamics of the community that we're talking about, in whatever community it is. So I know, from Aboriginal community, there's just some really clear roles and responsibilities that go with generation and where you fit into your community. So it's making sure that that each party is being consulted. We don't, for example, we don't want the elders to design something that for youth to use and it doesn't fit. It's simple as that, I guess. Just making sure that everyone's involved and everyone has a say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Daniel. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I would love to continue this discussion a lot more, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. And so I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Nikhila, Daniel, Christy and Jefa, for joining us today and for sharing your collective wisdom. I know I've taken a lot away from this, and design is a personal passion of mine. So I'd like to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here with us today and for the engaging questions in the Q&A panel. As you leave, there'll be a quick 5-question survey that'll pop up on your screen, and we'd really appreciate if you could please complete this survey, and as it'll help us with our future sessions that we're having. And I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday, where we'll be discussing violence against women in disaster. I hope you enjoyed this session as much as I have, and thank you all for attending.